Are there different types of energies? We're going to speak with men. We're going to explore some of the different energies that there are. My name is Honora Foah. I am a multidisciplinary artist. I work mostly in the performing arts, new types of performance, opera, dance, and theater. We have a very interesting panel today. It's small so that we really get to dig a little deeper and explore personally. The three men who are on this panel and I think we're going to undertake to interrogate masculinity, to really dig under a little bit and experience together what are the forces that we're dealing with. How are they originally and how do they get shaped personally into a personal psychology, and how do they get shaped culturally? I had a wonderful mentor, a man named James Hillman, who was one of the founders of archetypal psychology. And one of the things that he said about psychology, but I think it applies to a lot of things that we're trying to do, if we're really talking about fundamental change, it just has to come at a different level than simply political change. There has to be political change, but how do we dig under it? And what he says about working that way is that the first principle of the psychological method holds that any phenomenon to be understood must be sympathetically imagined. So I hope that's what we're going to do here, is to try to really sympathetically imagine. And I think this beautiful dance was very helpful in that. If my gentlemen would come on. Sit down. I think Nazir Afzal has already been introduced. I will just say that I was really hoping to do the part of the introduction where he's almost a knight. I got very excited that I could introduce someone who was something like a knight. It was very exciting for me. If you remember, he is a chief crown prosecutor for Northwest of England, and in his jurisdiction, he has responsibility for more than 100,000 prosecutions a year. He's a tutor and a speaker, and he is recognized by several awards, the titles of which recognize him as one of the 100 most influential Muslims or Asians in the world, or the UK, whichever is larger. Okay, so. Alyas Karmani is an imam based in Bradford in the United Kingdom. He is director of the Diversity Project, which is a youth empowerment project which aims to unlock the potential of young people. He is also co-director of Street UK, which is an initiative that tackles criminality, gang involvement, sexual violence, social exclusion, and violent extremism. Drawing on his own experiences, Alyas emphasizes straight talk about sex, masculinity, identity, and how sexual repression plays a role in driving violence. He's also been the head of the race equality for the Welsh Assembly government, and he's worked for the Commission for Racial Equality in the UK, and all of that draws on his background as a psychologist, academic, researcher, and lecturer. I think you've also had a little taste of David Anderson, who is a filmmaker, perhaps best known for his astonishing and very beautiful animation work, but his work also includes dance, theater, live action, puppetry, television, and film. His film Dreamland Express won a British Academy Award, and there have been many other awards throughout his career. He said to me, most meaningfully for himself was the Hiroshima Peace Prize. His works are archived in collections at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, in collections in Hiroshima, Oberhausen, and the British Film Institute. The other thing about David is that and he also does a lot of community work and community building work. Partly, maybe that grows out of that. David is the father of 5 children, 4 of which are girls. And as such, I think he has a very strongly, he has a strong commitment to exploring both sides of the masculine element and the feminine element in child development. He was co-founder and trustee of the Lewis New School and the Pelham House Conference Center. And he's also an enthusiastic musician. He's got a band called In Bob We Trust. They just play Bob Dylan. And anyway, he's a wonderful friend. So here's our panel. Okay. There you go. Close. I really want to see you. Okay, some water. That would be like terrific. Okay, so I'm going to start with a quote, because a lot, I think, what we're going to end up talking about is the development of boys into men and what that means and what is masculinity anyway. So this is a quote that's often attributed to Gloria Steinem. I couldn't quite find if that was exactly true. But she said, "We've begun to raise daughters more like sons, but few have the courage to raise our sons more like daughters." So that's sort of more of a title thing, but I'd actually like to start a little more personally and ask you about your own lives. So if you're willing, Alyas, would you start and begin maybe speaking?
It's painful. and I think when you sit down with a group of men and you really kind of deconstruct what's constructed our masculinity, it can be very painful. I grew up in a very macho, alpha male, violent culture, violent dad, poor family. And you know, how was I expected to escape from particular models of masculinity? I was expected to be a doctor or a lawyer. Nazir, my dad would have loved you, okay? And if I didn't do that, I was a failure. And, you know, I had a violent father who, you know, when he was frustrated and angry, he would take that violence out on me. And all my life, he's never told me he's proud of me. Wow. And so when I work with men, and young men in particular, I tell them, tell your children that you're proud of them. And tell your men that you're proud of them and you love them. And you love them as well. And it is painful. It is painful. He said it once accidentally. One of the things, I'm a politician as well, so I won my election. And of course, that was lots of status for him. Because you were just an object. You see, it's interesting, we've talked about the objectification of women, but men are also objectified in lots of cultures. You know, although I grew up in a South Asian working class culture, it's no different to Irish young men I've worked with, Jamaican young men that I've worked with. It's the same thing, that you are an object that your parents are living vicariously through. They expect you to be something that is used to accentuate their power and their status. And sadly, I've taken this approach, and my dad's not here at the moment. I've taken this approach to my life, which is that, you know, if I generally behave the opposite of my dad, I'm on the right tracks. And that's a very painful thing to do. Yeah. I'm glad he's not here. Something would be flying through the air. Okay, he never missed as well. Yeah. It's sad, you know, when it comes to the point when you then are big enough to say to your dad, if you hit me, I'll hit you back. And how do you escape from that, kind of those models of masculinity, that alpha male, that tough culture? You know, the young men I work with are amazing. You know, the young men I work with are quite amazing because they've got all the odds against them. But, you know, they're using their counterculture to break cycles. you know, in terms of masculinity. And I'm going to talk about a couple of the experiences I had. One of my experiences, obviously, was the anti-racist movement, and it's part of who I've been. You know, the anti-racist movement in the 70s and the 80s in the UK was black people, men and women, and white people as well, together in solidarity, shoulder to shoulder, working together for social justice. And it's the same as the civil rights movement as well. And what I found is that one of the things I've seen dismantled over the years is that partnership between men and women.
Yeah.
In fact, you can't even find a language which describes men and women working together for a common purpose in a positive way. I actually actively ask you to seek and look for that language. Where's the language that describes? It's us versus them. It's polarized.
Yeah.
And I think part of the challenge I had when I was listening to you yesterday was like, you know, taking those powerful messages to all these other audiences. So they say, this isn't just voices of women, this is my sister's voice, this is my mother's voice, this is my daughter's voice, this is my voice, this is something that I have to stand up and fight for.
Yeah.
And the other thing was, and it's another thread that's been, you know, a beautiful thing about yesterday and today, which is about art. You know, I was expected to be this. I did art secretly, without telling my parents. And that's why my art teacher was my mentor. She was a really important person in my life. She was critical. I was at a critical juncture in my life, and many of my peers went the wrong way. And, you know, I always say every single one of us in this room was at that critical juncture in our life where we make a choice between two things. And it's, you know, what it is, by the grace of God or whatever it is, something intervenes at that point which just channels us along the right way. Too many men are being channeled along the wrong direction. Art is very important because I grew up in a world of violence, of power, of entitlement, of control, of subjugation, of repression. And art is the balance in terms of beauty and love and hope.
What happened to you personally? Because you talked to me about this before. So your idea was you wanted to be an artist, and then what?
Well, it was just, again, it was having those experiences which gave me a different perspective. You know, allowed
but didn't
me to.
You also say that that was like out? You know, that you said you wanted to be an artist, and it was like.
Yeah. Do you know what? Although I didn't train as an artist, the creative process has always been there. Even as an imam, people say, you know, it's still creative for me. It's the ability to try to transform. People who are very socially conservative, with ideas which are, you know, very much a complete kind of opposite to the ideas I have, and trying to transform them. It's still a creative process. Whatever I do, that creative process has still been there. So art is a really important part of that.
But boys in your milieu were not going to be artists. That was
not a thing. That's not allowed. That was not allowed at all.
Nazir, what about you? I mean, when you were growing up, were you very strongly channeled? And let me before I want to ask you something else with that. Do you remember, maybe when you were very small, do you remember a moment or an incident or anything that ever happened where you were like, oh, this is what's being expected of me, and this is about boys. This is about what growing into being a man is going to be?
I mean, I have a lot in common with Dia, because Dia comes from the northwest frontier. She's Pathan, I'm Pathan. My family come from the traditional tribalistic parts of Pakistan. They moved to Birmingham in England, the traditional tribalistic parts of Birmingham. So the whole idea, I mean, that's the part of the world that Malala comes from. There's a part of the world where 150 children were murdered a couple of months ago, and there was no opportunities for anybody who wanted an education, boy or girl, quite frankly, unless you had wealth or money or somebody who had influence or power. So they deliberately made a choice to come to England to give me all those opportunities. I was very lucky to be born in England. I was very lucky to grow up supported by a mother and father who clearly wanted me to succeed in a way that perhaps they felt they hadn't done it themselves. My mother was looking after 6 boys and a girl, all under 12. She had it harder than my father. My father worked 24/7, as is very common in minority communities, the need to work harder. But there was no suggestion that there was anything different between me and my sister. She's younger than me, and when I was 12, I decided to become a vegetarian. My mum taught me how to cook. She then taught me how to sew. because she thought, at some point I might leave home, and how am I going to darn my socks, it came in very useful, because a year later, some bullies at school decided to take the sleeve off my jacket, and so I went home, and I was too ashamed to mention it to my parents, and I sewed my sleeve back on again, and for a whole year I went with this sewn on. It survived a whole year, so I was pretty good at sewing back then. But I think those of us who grew up in the 60s and 70s, 1860s and 1870s, it was overt racism. I mean, we were just different. And so I don't think the gender thing was a major issue back then. It was the fact that I was different, full stop. I came up to my bullies and I said, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but your words will not hurt me." And it worked, because after that, it was only ever sticks and stones, And I got beaten, and I got abused. And I think that, so when Alyas says, in terms of masculinity, maybe the perception is that masculinity is somehow the need to be violent, the need to be powerful. In actual fact, in my case, it was just having to want to stand up to people who were ridiculing you, who were abusing you. And that's not a gender thing. That's simply a feeling inside you. And my perception is that all of us as human beings, surely we should stand up to those that are trying to abuse us, wherever our gender, whatever our race, or whatever our background. And so I think my upbringing wasn't a case of, this is a boy's job and this is a girl's job. If my sister had wanted to pursue more education, she'd have been allowed to do so, which was very, very difficult. And Alyas is absolutely right. They wanted me to be a doctor or a scientist or an engineer, because the perception as a minority was that at some point they're going to kick us out of England and send you back to wherever you came from. And we've got enough lawyers in Pakistan. We just want doctors, scientists, and engineers, something that's valuable back there. And so I had a conversation with my father and my mother saying, "I want to be a lawyer." And they went, "What?" It's almost like being an artist. It wasn't seen as being a career that we should be pursuing because of the dynamic that existed. But I think from my perspective, I was very fortunate that I wasn't conscious of the fact that I was treated differently as a boy as I was to a girl. And I think if you ask me about the moment I realized where I was different, when I was 8 years old, it was the first time my family decided to go back to Pakistan, and we went overland. In the days where you could travel overland over Yugoslavia, and Afghanistan was open, Iran was open. And we traveled all the way there in a Ford Transit van. And we traveled all the way back. And my 6-year-old cousin, I was 8, my 6-year-old cousin, she died on the way back between Germany and Belgium. And my father and mother decided, we can't stop now, because the authorities will want to know why she died, and we'd have to bury her here. We'd be stuck in Germany. Nobody wants to be stuck in Germany, apparently. But the point being, they didn't want that to happen. And so they said, "Nazir, will you hold her for the rest of the journey?" And so for a day, I was holding my 6-year-old cousin as we went on the ferry, as we went back into England. And then it became a big saga. People discovered, obviously, it became national news. And this was when I was 8. So I realized, actually, they chose me to hold her because I was the young male there. She was somehow, it wouldn't seem out of whatever the word is, it wouldn't seem wrong for a man to be holding a younger girl in his hands sleeping. She was dead. My point is that, then I realized actually maybe they didn't ask my sister, they asked me to hold her. And maybe that's my role as a protector, as somebody that ought to be looking after women or young girls. And maybe, if somebody asked me in the last session, maybe that was the turning point in my life, a realization that there is more to my life, that I should be doing more to protect women and girls. And I'm absolutely right about this in the sense that my parents wanted me to follow my dreams. And I would hope that, I've got an 18-year-old daughter, I want her to follow her dreams. In no way have I ever been prescriptive about what she should do with her life. In the same way that I would expect others of the same. My 3 other boys, they can do what they want. And quite frankly, they're younger than their sister, so they get told what to do on a regular basis. So I think that has to be the hope for the future, is that families grow up thinking that there is no difference, and it'll take generations. It'll take generations. It won't happen overnight. But my parents gave me the grounding that enabled me to think that way.
David, have your daughters ever told their brother what to do?
Two of them are here. You could go ask them.
Yeah,
I think so.
I think so. Yeah, so was there a time, because your story is a little bit different, because your father was an artist, yeah? So, or maybe it's not different. I mean, how did you become aware? When did you become aware, oh, I'm a boy, I'm a man? I mean, not so, all right, that happens gradually, but was there an incident or a moment where you're like, wow, there's some stuff that, you know, that I'm really supposed to do here?
Yeah, I think probably I'm an example of how the liberal middle classes can have angst and be psychologically damaged, because both my parents were artists. But fairly dysfunctional, although, you know, I was well loved, but I was the only one, which is a dangerous position to be in. And I think probably that was one of the motivators in having lots of children. I didn't want my kids, or, you know, a kid to be alone. Because you kind of take on the whole responsibility for your parents, however kind of screwed up or odd they might be. And that's, I think, too much to bear. And I think that's one of the things that happened to me. I mean, I'm supportive, you know, obviously in traditional tribal traditions, there are transition points, or in the major religions as well. We have, you know, there's puberty, or there's a marking from boyhood into manhood, which I think is a very useful thing, and I think it's part of a necessary ritual that has kind of been washed away, mostly, particularly by losing religion, by, you know, the families breaking down. Those sort of markers have gone. But I don't think it's as neat as one transition point, but it's a good place to start. So for me, I think there were all sorts of transitions. I think I actually had to grow up very early when my parents were separating, in a way that part of me had to become a man when I just wasn't ready for it, age 7 or 6 or something like that. And that led to a kind of, you know, my version of a shutting down of feelings, which is a very common thing to guys. So, you know, a bit of me grew up, but the other bit didn't. And then the rest of life, falling in love, going to art school, you know, the moves into the unknown were all the sort of transitions that helped me psychologically man up, as you said to me earlier. Yeah. And actually the key thing, you know, age 32 was when my father died, and I spent the night in the chapel with him, laid out, and could have the conversations that I'd never finished with him. And that actually that's both father to son, and it's also embracing death. And I think death, that's when we embrace death, and we've heard stories of people having to do that far, far, far too young. But it is it's part of the whole business of life. So,
I mean, that death altogether, and then a word that's used all the time is you talk about when a young man is blooded. That's a thing you say about something that's, to a large extent, considered necessary, that a boy has to be blooded, then he's a man, and it can take a lot of different forms. Certainly culturally, but it's still kind of a thing. I mean, it can be quite symbolic. But what I'm hearing from all of these stories is that, you know, it starts out a little bit stronger than it, at least in my experience, is usually put on girls, the sense of I'm carrying the family, and if it's correct to use the word, in a way, the honor of the family, the future of the family, that there's already that burden, and that one of the consequences may be beginning to shut down feelings in order to kind of shoulder the thing. And then there's this thing you have to do that is, there's a violence that is associated with being a man. Do you have...
Yeah, I mean, absolutely right. Traditions, I mean, people say to you there's a traditional role for men, a traditional role for women, a cultural role for men. But men make traditions. Men make cultures. I mean, the example I tend to use is the one involving Sleeping Beauty. You all know the story of Sleeping Beauty, where she's allegedly she's poisoned by the wicked witch, and then enters into a coma, and she's awoken by the kiss of the prince. The original version of that story, the young girl is going through the forest, and she's raped by somebody. She goes into catatonic shock, and she ends up completely in a coma. She only awakes from that coma 9 months later when she gives birth to the baby conceived of that rape. Now, Disney didn't like that version. So you've got the situation where an original version was bad man, bad guy, to one that we now all believe, wicked witch, bad woman, man, prince, good guy. And see what man has done. We've made that traditional story, and we do that with all our nursery rhymes, everything else. And so we're inculcating from an early age with young boys invariably, men, they're the prince. Women, they're the wicked witch.
See, but Nazir, now I think there's just a massive disconnect now. You know, young men just don't have the role models. Yeah. And men can only be good men if they see good men. That's the only thing, and they're not. Either, you know, I hear it from my young men I work with. They said, you know, they have absent fathers, and if they, you know, if they have present fathers, they wish they were absent. You know, and so who's their educator? And it's the street. That's why we call our project Street Project. And the whole ethos was that, again, growing up, you are emotionally repressed. I always say to my young men, did you speak to your father about your feelings? It's just kind of like a bit of a test question. Did you talk to your dad about your feelings? Did you open up about, this is what I'm going through at the moment, Dad? I've got a crush on this boy. I'm having difficulty with puberty and first thing. And they all look at me with this kind of real, are you stupid? Are you know what it's like. We don't talk to our dads. And that's why our project is about becoming a surrogate dad, because young men are looking for a surrogate dad. Sometimes that's a gang leader. Sometimes that's a charismatic preacher who's going to channel them towards extremism. It's a cult leader. It's a drug pusher. It's that search for family, belonging, and that father figure in their life. So the street is their educator. And what we're finding is that these completely distorted and perverted models of masculinity that are being adopted now. Why? Because, okay, the immersion in the online world. You know, Philip Zimbardo talks about, by the age of 21, your average man has 10,000 hours of porn, gaming, and surfing. And it's completely reprogramming their brains, and it's dumbing down their emotional intelligence.
Well, going back a little further in relationship to what you just said, why is it so tough for the fathers? Like, what's the problem with the fathers that their sons aren't coming to them? You know, what's going on for them?
It's a peer thing. I mean, I don't know what Alyas's or David's experience is, but my experience is, you know, I regularly go to places of worship or whatever, organized community groups, and say to them, please talk about violence against women and girls, please talk about human rights, please talk about supporting, and they say, to my face, they pay lip service. The moment they were out of my sight, I can't do that. You know, I'll lose face in my community. People will turn around to me and say, you such weak. You know, as somehow suggesting that, you know, actually talking about equality and equal rights and gender equality, all that sort of stuff, is actually a weak thing. And that kind of perception, unfortunately, is so deep that Alyas is absolutely right. Role models. I run mentoring groups as well. I'm Chancellor of University. Alyas runs mentoring. I'm sure David. That is such an important thing to do. And at the same time, you have to recognize the people who do the mentoring, because nobody values it. Society never values it. It doesn't value, society pays bankers a lot of money and God knows what else, but it doesn't value mentors who really are making the difference in terms of the next generation.
And so, I mean, absolutely, you know, where the energy is going is into the sons, but I mean, can the dads be mentored? I mean, it seems to me that, you know, to a certain extent, that's where so much of the agony is, you know, that the father is and you know, the father loves his son.
Well, a lot of feminists tell me they've got great fathers. and clearly great mothers as well. And a lot of people have been sort of dissing Islam. I would never diss Islam. The way Muslims that I am, the Islam that I was brought up to believe, was told that a mother is 3 times more deserving of respect than a father, for example. It was, all of those things were taught to me from a very, very early age, and I've learnt it myself, and I've done my own reading. But there needs to be a counter-narrative to those people who would want to suggest something different. And regrettably, they're the loudest voices that we hear at the moment. There's a certain place for women, certain place for men. And I really do think that, fathers can be mentored. Fathers can be given hope. Because very often they're fighting inside themselves. I keep saying to my children, I've said it to so many people, stop asking me what we should do today. That's not just my role. Can't we together work out what we should do today? But they somehow look to me as Dad, you will decide what we should do. No, I won't. It's actually a burden I don't want to carry. Let's share it. And I think that, so we do put additional pressure on fathers where we can actually help them. And I have very few male friends, very few male friends, and very few with whom I'm comfortable to talk about my life or the things I feel. Whereas my impression is that women have many more. I mean, I'm never on the phone. You're always on the phone, some of you, and so I think that we need networks of men. We need, I was in Washington recently, and I said, you've got a 1 million man march for what happened in Ferguson. You've got a 1 million man march for civil rights. Where's your 1 million man march for supporting women's rights? And they said, we would struggle.
But Nazir, or just human rights, Because that's I think, again, this is coming back, and sorry, David, just coming back onto what I felt. It's about not men against women or women against men. It's not about us versus them. That's the whole thing. That's the only paradigms that are being offered. Even what he for she, which is the campaign, the hashtag with Emma Watson, even that still I don't think is enough. I remember doing a talk once, and I mentioned this quote, that, behind every successful man there's a woman.
A very surprised woman, usually.
Yeah. And when I said that, I mentioned that quote, and then I said to the audience, I think it's a lie. And there was a gasp in the audience, okay, making assumptions about me. Because I said, because she's always at his side. They are side by side, shoulder to shoulder. You cannot, somehow separate, the woman from the man in terms of the overall success. And so I think that's part of the problem as well. We've got archaic paradigms in terms of how we, present, the kind of unity and the kind of solidarity between men and women. And one of the important things, again, I think about masculinity and about the older generation, it's very important, is that you show, and this is what needs to happen, dads, people in power, elected members, faith leaders, politicians, whoever they are, they need to show solidarity with those people who are victims. And they need to stand by side with them. And they shouldn't be blaming the victims. Again, we grew up in cultures where individuals blame the victims and somehow give impunity to those people who are the perpetrators. And that's
but that's the power dynamic. I mean, why do they do that? They do that because they're getting on the good side of people who really are on the more powerful element of it. But I do want to talk about that, but I wanted to ask you something.
Yeah. I wanted to say something.
Oh, say.
No, go on, ask me first, and then I'll...
No,
well,
it's just that I know that
I'm neither a lawyer or an imam, and you guys are good at talking. I'm just kind of, I do things with my hands. So.
Right? Well, it's just that I know that you really have made a conscious effort to cultivate a certain kind of male friends, that you make sure that you have time with them and that you do things in a certain kind of way. And I wondered if you'd just speak to the whole thing that Nazir started to bring up.
That's was partly a response to that, which is peer-to-peer mentoring among men, and having the courage to set that up. It seems a bit weird, it seems a bit awkward, but just start talking and just start opening up. Tell your story. Don't be afraid to explore. And I think that is very important. I mean, there are various sort of men's movements. Some swing a bit too far one way into ritual, but generally just men need to get together and not down the pub, not swigging it back, but actually in a reflective, quiet environment. And then, also across the age, it's good to have your peer group, but we need to do the mentoring to young people as well. And I think also, I was thinking earlier, we talk about masculinity, that it is about the feminine and the masculine principle that we all carry, and it's the balance of those things in us. So, we need to draw on that. I think traditionally, we've suppressed the feminine side, and we need to harness some of that energy and vice versa. And actually, it's more about becoming a human being than becoming a man. So it's about values, about compassion, about integrity, those things.
So where is the fear? I mean, from the time you're really little and you're hanging around with boys, and anything that girls do is yicky, don't be a girl. The worst thing you can say is to a guy is he's a girl. You call him a man, a woman, you call a man a girl, it's just the worst thing ever, which, makes me feel fantastic. Well, but it's, what is that? Why is there such an intense fear about anything more feminine being expressed? Expressing solidarity with women, we would be shamed if we did the stuff that you said. Why is masculinity so fragile that it has to be defended all the time?
I think Alyas was saying.
I'm not here to defend masculinity.
No,
These are archaic models of different. We want to dismantle them. Really,
it is a dynamic, right?
Yeah.
It's a thing that's going
again,
on all the time.
I think role models are quite critical. On a global level, let's look at the iconic role models for men which are out there. Even when I talk to young men and say, tell me about a role model that has, where we celebrate the hardworking, compassionate, just, loving, caring person who's there, bringing up his family, a real good parent. Where do we celebrate that in anywhere in society, in popular culture, in media? Where do we celebrate that?
No statues.
Okay, and instead we've got and in the urban context I work, we've got the gangbangers. Grand Theft Auto, I call it, is the paradigm for young men. It's the world of robbing, stealing, pimping with impunity and getting away with it. And even when they say, look, Obama, he's obviously, President Obama, is he a male role model? And they'll say, yes, he is. He's a violent man. So therefore they equate, all of the role models are offered to them. They're either violent, they're either conspicuously materialistic, they objectify and they control and suppress women, okay? And that's really what's offered. Or they are athletic kind of gods, they're models of perfection. All of those are completely unattainable for men. Yeah. So we need to create some real role models for them.
Absolutely. And re-educating from, that kids are, they are learning through video games, learning through porn, so they learn about love and relationship through those things. That there's got to be more education.
We mustn't underestimate the challenge, though. I mean, every International Women's Day, every 8th of March, some groups of men will turn around and say, "Where's our International Man's Day?" And my response is that there's 364 days a year for that, Yeah. And so you've got to realize that this is about power. Men do not invariably, as a group, do not want to give up power. Every issue of domestic violence, sexual violence is not about sex, it's about power. And time again, one has to recognize that. So you've got to make it as easy as possible to realize that sharing power does not mean losing power. They call me the masculine feminist. I have no idea what that means, but my point is that you can't underestimate the challenges that men face or communities face. I dealt with a case a few years ago where there's a woman called Kaniz Riaz, and she was a mother of 5, and she wanted a divorce from her husband. She got a divorce from her husband. And then the next thing that happened was her house was burnt down, she was killed, as were 4 of her children. The 5th suffered significant injuries. Now, the evidence was overwhelming that the estranged father was responsible, and we were able to convict him. But there are still people in his community, and certainly men, who think that the house was haunted. They would rather believe that a ghost killed that family rather than a man. And that's about making excuses for men. All the cases I've dealt with involving grooming and the rest of it, no, it's the society's fault for turning them into whatever they're turning them into. No, it's not. Take responsibility for what you have done.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, that's the separation that you get, going back to the video game, all those things, that you don't learn real emotion. You learn adrenaline. You can even learn lust, after some porno avatar. But, you don't learn about real feelings, and that's what needs to be explored more.
And And there's a complete failure in sex and relationship education in schools. You know, in the UK, our kids have 3 45-minute lessons to help them navigate one of the most challenging things that they're going to experience, especially men. We work in prisons with young men, and I'll give you one quick example of Michael, one young man that we worked with. His first sexual experiences at the age of 14 with a group of guys, you know, him having oral sex, all his mates watching. You know, it's completely extinguished any kind of compassion, intimacy, softness, love from that whole experience. His view is just like the rest of them, that they're just bitches and hoes to be used and abused and discarded. And he's never going to experience an alternative to that until we sat down, we spoke to him, we had a mature discussion with him. And that's all he wanted, a mature discussion with an older person, just to talk about those particular experiences. And, you know, I remember him saying to me that, oh, when I leave prison, my boys are going to come, they're going to bring a limo, and there's going to be a girl in there, she's going to do this and that to me and all that. And I remember him calling me up the day that he left prison, and he called me up, he says, you know what I said? I'm not going to do that. Okay, that's not what I'm about anymore. I want to be in a proper relationship. I want to be with someone who I genuinely care for and love. It's not rocket science. And that shows the disconnect that we have in society, the massive disconnect that we have in terms of developing that emotional intelligence in men.
And it's also, the work is never done. So, I mean, it's also about the parents and their relationships and their concepts of love and their intimacy. And if that's not around, so we each need to be working on that. That work is never done. We've got to continue. And I think one of the things where we get stuck, I think Robert Moore talks this in The King, the Warrior, the Lover. It's about, we don't transition from boy psychology. You know, you see men that haven't made the transition, they're still in boy psychology. So that's where you see the high chair tyrant, you see the executive throwing his toys out with the pram. You know, and that's where the aggression is. You see it in the financial systems, you know, that's driven by a male thing. You know, I think Christine Lagarde said, you know, if it had been Lehman Sisters, economics would be slightly different.
That's interesting. When you say that it's about power, which obviously that is one of the core issues of simply not wanting to surrender the power, are there also, when you work with these young people, you obviously have to paint an alternative picture of when you surrender this, or when you lose something or seem to lose something, a picture of what is actually gained by equality. Is there a way that you work with that?
See, I think just with my experience, and it resonates with lots of the young men that I want, they want to escape those models and those paradigms of masculinity. They want to escape it. They're looking for an alternative. You know, again, with young men who work on the street, drug selling, you know, drug pushing, you know, it's about £500 a day or £50 a day. I always say that, use that as a kind of model. And it's about them taking, and they make that change because they want a way out of £500 a day, and they want to take pride in working for 50 quid a day and what goes with it. And it's the same issue here. It's about, you know, showing them that alternative. And it's also about making it cool as well. When it becomes cool for men to respect, honor, you know, protect their equality, value women, when that becomes cool, and when the opposite of that, which is about objectifying them and you know, being violent towards them is uncool, you'll see again that quite significant shift. And our men become assets. They're assets that go out into that world. And I say they go out into their space, and they then have that ripple effect in terms of then influencing their peers. And that's how you create a movement.
Do you have other specific ideas about how that becomes cool, or how it becomes, you know, obviously for the younger ones it needs to be cool, but then it progresses into something else. But how do you work with it that you actually draw that picture and it starts to become something really appealing?
Well, it's a societal issue. It affects every single one of us, and it requires a multi-layered solution. And we're working against what I call the porno-industrial complex. It's one of the biggest, you know, complexes in the world, multi-billion-pound industry, which is obviously churning out material, which is having a profound effect. And when I talk about porn with young men, I'm not talking about porn which, you know, one would describe as soft or, you know, days gone by. Okay, we're talking about genres which humiliate, which degrade, which celebrate rape, where there's young men are excreting and urinating on women, being raped from every orifice. And it's really getting men to actually deconstruct that and saying, is this really acceptable? Okay, and then also,
is it really what they want?
Yeah. No, it's not. It's not what they want.
In their lives,
Yeah.
is that, you know...
Yeah.
that-
But they
is
have
that-
no alternatives. This is what I'm saying. It's hard to break these paradigms when there's no counter-narrative, because we're not connecting with these worlds. They're for individuals who are forsaken. And then, like I said, my own experience was, how was I going to break out of that paradigm? And I was just fortunate that I had these experiences in my life which just channeled me along the kind of right direction.
I think this is also one of the areas where art comes into it, because the creation of those counter-narratives is partly that job of just creatively making those images in such a way that it becomes something more powerful in a cultural form, and then someone in your positions at least has something to begin to point to. But what I'm taking out of a lot of what you're saying is that the first thing really has so much to do with the capacity to listen and to allow the emotional intelligence itself to rise instead of repressing it.
Absolutely right.
Yeah.
I mean, on a micro level, we can all do what we do in small ways or in big ways, and have a million of us doing this kind of thing. On a macro level, it's about changing cultures. It's about understanding that this is a human rights issue. It's not a women's rights, a human rights issue, and it's so much easier to be able to build a narrative around human rights. In the same way that we fight for people who are oppressed. Let me make this very clear. No society will succeed if it oppresses women. End of. And the business case is there, never mind the moral case, the legal case, the ones that we all know of. In the United Kingdom, it costs every year, domestic abuse costs the state 50 billion euros a year. That's in health costs, lost income, criminal justice costs, you name it. What a business, that's 50 billion a year we can use in much better things. So there's a business case, moral case, legal case, human rights case, etc., etc. The reality is that we need more and more people articulating it. And I think Alyas is right. We have to have many more role models out there. We've got to start celebrating them in a way that perhaps we don't do at the moment. We've got to do what we do about challenging conversations with people who, we should never go to a pub or a club and hear somebody say something nasty about women or whatever. We should challenge that rather than laugh about it and pretend it's not our problem. It is our problem, I want every rapist, every sexual offender, everybody who's been abusing somebody to have the ghost of the person they abused them on their shoulder all their lives. And that is the only way you can do that is by saying to them, challenging them, on a daily basis. Eventually, I hope.
Nazir, on that point as well, obviously, just quickly, that perpetrator programs. We're one of the very few male sexual violence perpetrator programs in the UK. We're just not putting the investment. And the sad thing is that I know this is sometimes an unpopular view, that many of these individuals are very damaged themselves. I've had young men who have been raped themselves, who have been, and then that's been used as leverage for them to then groom and rape other girls. So, but one of the interesting things about that, someone who becomes a rapist and a sex offender and a sexual predator, do you know what? I can predict it at the age of 9 and 10. And you can as well.
At 3?
Yeah, we can predict. I can predict at 10 and 11 when I see sexually aggressive behavior, when I see a certain type of language that's being used, when I see a certain pushing of boundaries with regards to I know what's going to happen to that individual. I know teachers know that. Yeah. But this is it. Too many people are turning a blind eye. And this is really unacceptable. And it, again, does come down to resources and economics as well, because I say investing in young people is never a loss. The more we invest, the more we grow society into a just and fair and moral society. And by not putting that investment in, and it seems ridiculous that, we don't have programs like this in school. We operate on a shoestring. Many of the NGOs here who are doing such life-saving work are just operating on an absolute shoestring, okay, on such, small resources when they're doing such critical work.
Yeah, I totally agree. More support for the work these guys are doing. It's got to be in education, it's got to be in grassroots groups, and you need government to change and take a long-term view that's where the future is.
That's where the future is.
Society gets what it pays for, or not pays for, as the case may be. I remember there was a production of Oliver going around schools in England. You know what happens in Oliver to Nancy? Nancy gets killed, but in this production of Oliver, they decided, no, we can't have that. We can't expose children to domestic abuse. 1 in 4 of them are exposed to it at home. And we wrap them up in cotton wool and think that's the answer. No, we should be having proper conversations, and that's how we'll tackle this issue.
I would like to thank these gentlemen, and I think one of the most important points, obviously, is about role models. So my advice would be to, the next time you see a good man, you give him a kiss, because we've got to keep them around, and they are really going to be the pillar of being able to go forward into this new imagination. So thank you.
Great, yes, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.